Let's talk about suspension sag. Hello, I'm Ian, and this is Eric. We're both from Touratech-USA, and today we're going to show you guys how to adjust suspension sag on a motorcycle. The reason that adjusting your suspension sag is important is because as you add or remove weight and passengers from your motorcycle, it changes how high the rear suspension rides on the bike, and that changes the angle that the frame is sitting at, and that changes the way the bike is handling. So you want to make sure that that's exactly where it's meant to be, otherwise your ride's not going to go just as smoothly as it could. There's two types of common suspension sag that are measured. First, you have your static sag, and that's just the weight of the motorcycle resting against the spring. It's a very sensitive measurement that's used to help determine what spring rate you should be running. The second kind of sag that we're going to be focusing on a lot more, we call race sag. And what that is the weight of the motorcycle plus you in your riding gear, plus a passenger if you carry one, plus any luggage that you have when you're setting your bike up for a particular trip. The most important reason to measure and adjust your suspension sag is to give your suspension the best possible chance of keeping your tire on the ground the whole time you're riding. Let's imagine our motorcycle has 10 inches of suspension travel, and we want our race sag to come in somewhere around 30%. So we're going to use 3 inches of suspension travel just with sag. That's when you get on your motorcycle with your passenger, with your luggage. And that way your motorcycle has 7 inches of up travel left available for when you hit a bump in the road. The reason that you want to get close to that 30% number is so that your motorcycle has enough down travel where if you ride over a pothole, the wheel can follow down into the pothole, keep the tire on the ground. But you also want to have enough up travel so that if you hit a bump, some kind of embedded rock, the wheel has enough up travel that it can move up without hitting bottom out and upsetting the chassis of the motorcycle from hitting that bump. If that happens, your tire's not on the ground and your motorcycle's not making traction. If your motorcycle's not making traction, it's not accelerating when you want, it's not slowing down when you want, and it's not turning when you want. So we're gonna need a few basic tools to do this job. You're gonna need a tape measure, a piece of tape, and a Sharpie to mark a fixed point on the motorcycle, and a pad of paper to write down the measurements we're gonna take. Lastly, we're going to need to know what the total suspension travel on the end of the motorcycle that we're going to be adjusting is. On this KTM 1090R, the rear suspension travel is 220 millimeters. So we're going to need to take 2 measurements here, and to make sure that we get the measurements from the exact same place every single time, we're going to mark a fixed point on the motorcycle. We want to go roughly vertical from the center point of the rear axle, and I'm going to do that with a piece of tape right here on the pannier rack, and I'm going to draw an X on it with my marker to make sure we get the same measurement every time. The first measurement we're going to get is the distance between the axle and the X we drew with the suspension fully extended. This bike doesn't have a center stand, so what we're going to do is have Eric pull the motorcycle over onto the kickstand until the back tire just comes off the ground, and then I'm going to take the measurement from the axle to the X. Perfect. On our bike, our first measurement was 580 millimeters. I'm going to write that down as number 1. That's our extended measurement. Right now, we're setting this motorcycle up for just Eric. We don't have luggage. He's not carrying a passenger, but we are making sure that he's wearing all of his riding gear, including his helmet and his boots. Those are usually the 2 heaviest parts. And when I say go, I'm going to balance the motorcycle. He's going to pick his feet up off the ground, and I'm going to repeat my measurement from the center line of the axle to the X. All right, feet up. Got it. Our second measurement was 506 millimeters. So I'm going to write that down as number 2, and then we get to do some math. Okay, the first measurement we took was 580 millimeters with the suspension fully extended. The second measurement we took was the suspension compressed with Eric sitting on the bike. We got 506 millimeters. So we subtract number 2 from number 1, we get our sag measurement of 74 millimeters. That's our first sag measurement. This KTM 1090R has a total suspension travel of 220 millimeters. And if you multiply that by 30%, you get 66 millimeters. And that's what our target sag number should be. So because we measured 74 millimeters in our first sag measurement, We're gonna increase the preload on the spring using the hydraulic adjuster, and we're gonna take a second measurement with the bike compressed and see how much closer we got to that 66 millimeters. Different shocks use different ways of adjusting the spring preload. This shock uses a hydraulic preload adjuster, which is real convenient because you can do it without any tools. Let me show you how this thing works. There we go, that's better. So this knob here is attached to a small hydraulic reservoir. And when you turn it to the plus side, you're pumping hydraulic fluid into this black piece, which pushes the silver ring down against the spring. That's adding spring preload. That's gonna reduce our sag number, bring that sag measurement to a smaller number. That's what we want. So we were about 12 millimeters off our target sag number before. We've added 10 clicks of preload to the rear shock. Eric's gonna jump back on the motorcycle with all his gear on, and we're gonna take this measurement one more time and see what we got. All right, feet up. Okay. This time we measured 513 millimeters. So if you subtract that from 580, we get 67 millimeters, which is almost exactly right. Our target was 66 millimeters, so our sag is now adjusted properly for Eric riding solo with his gear on. High five. That's the worst ever. If you're within a few millimeters one way or another of what your target sag is, that's really good to go. From there, it's up to the rider preference. If they like their bike to ride just a little higher, just a little lower, it really just changes the handling characteristics slightly. One good thing to know about this process here is that the spring that's on this bike is perfect for Eric. We were almost at the minimum preload when Eric is just about at his minimum load. If we kept cranking and cranking and cranking and we could never get to the target, that would mean that the spring rate was too soft if we ran out of travel on the hydraulic preload adjuster. Alternatively, if we had too little sag, if we were somewhere in the 50s or the 40s and we were not able to take the hydraulic preload adjuster far enough out to get to the target, that would mean that the spring rate was a little bit too stiff for Eric. If you're trying to do this on your bike and you're running into a situation either where you're too high or too low on your sag, you're gonna wanna change out your spring or your shock absorber to get that right back into where it needs to be. Some adventure bikes give you the ability to adjust the preload on the front suspension to adjust the sag. One thing to keep in mind if you're gonna adjust the fork sag is that there's a lot more friction in a set of forks than there is on the rear end. So you actually have to push the motorcycle down, let it naturally rebound to where it wants to rest, write down that number, and then lift the motorcycle and let it go to where it naturally wants to rest and write down that number. When you average that high number and the low number, that's your front suspension sag. That's the only way to work around the friction up front. Front suspension setup is really more sensitive to spring rate than the rear end is, so it would be really helpful to think about what kind of riding you like to do and then pick an appropriate spring rate from there. Very generally speaking, the more off-road you ride, the stiffer spring rate you're gonna want. The more road you ride, the softer spring rate you're gonna want. Most adventure bikes come with a softer rate than most riders need in the forks, so just going to something like a slightly stiffer than stock progressive spring is usually a really good upgrade. If you want to go deeper than that, we recommend talking to a suspension expert and figuring out how to set the bike up exactly for you. Just remember, this setup is specific now to Eric on this bike. There's not any given spring rate that's perfect for every bike or every rider. It's all about how you ride, what you wear, what you bring with you, and who you bring with you on the bike that you're riding.